Welcome back to my course, Socialism. Let me again draw a link between what we did for the past 2 weeks and what we are going to do today. If you follow the syllabus, you will notice that today's conversation is going to be about late Stalinism and so-called Tito's Heresy. So I will explain to you what it means. Okay. You also may have noticed that last time we discussed National Socialism in Germany, but before this we talked about National Bolshevism of Stalin in Russia in the 1930s. Okay, and today again I'm going back to Stalinism to discuss more Stalinist National Bolshevism in addition to what is labeled as so-called Tito's Heresy. Why am I doing this? I do it in many respects on purpose. I would like to emphasize, and I keep doing it again and again, that no matter how hard international socialists try to promote the ideals of socialism, which in theory should be internationalist, cosmopolitan, as soon as socialism becomes grounded, fulfilled in a particular culture, in a particular country, it sooner or later acquires nationalist dimensions. Okay, socialism becomes nationalized, and frequently on the ground it blends with all kind of nationalistic sentiments and identity politics. It happened in the past, it is happening right now. Again, that's one of the reasons I go back and forth, and in many respects I paired together these two opposing regimes, National Bolshevism of Stalin in Soviet Russia and National Socialism of Hitler in Germany, okay, to show to you how, on the one hand, in the Soviet Union, by focusing on this project of socialism in one country, Stalinist regime became more and more nationalized, catering to the interest of the Russian majority. But at the same time, we also stressed that Stalinist regime could not completely go ahead in the direction of nationalism because the Soviet Union was a multi-ethnic country. You could not simply cater to the interests of the Russian majority. Unlike Nazi Germany, where virulent or die-hard nationalism of Hitler and his cronies was blended with the socialist tradition of Germany. Okay, and it was easy for Hitlerites, for the Nazis, to cater to the interests of the Germans because Germany was essentially, and is not at present day, but in 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, it was a mono-ethnic country. So in this case, extreme nationalists in Germany could blend their ideas with socialism safely, catering to the interests of Germans. Okay, today we are going to discuss two things. First, we are going to explore how Stalinist regime after the Second World War and under the influence of the Second World War became more nationalistic, became more xenophobic. Okay, going to such extremes as anti-Semitism, which is strange because originally the message, cosmopolitan message of socialism, was directed against anti-Semitism. But again, the logic of nationalization of Bolshevism in Soviet Russia eventually took the Soviet regime to such extremes as anti-Semitism. But again, not completely. Still, Stalin couldn't go ahead to complete Russian nationalism. There was no way for him to do it. At the same time, the second thing we're going to discuss, it's very important, how this monolithic world of socialism, which was focused on worshipping the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union was considered this Jerusalem, metaphorically speaking, of course, Jerusalem of socialism, okay? Despite different attitudes to the Soviet Union, there were some critical voices. Still, for many people on the left, even those who did not completely agree with this brutalities, with the brutality of Stalinist policies, Soviet Union in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s was the symbol of socialism, embodiment of socialism. Yes, extreme, but still a great hope for change, okay? We are going to discuss, and that's the second thing which we're going to explore today, how this monolithic world of socialism was split apart, particularly because of so-called Yugoslavian heresy, promoted by Yugoslavian communist, charismatic Yugoslavian communist who was in charge of Yugoslavia, who was also a Stalinist. His name was Joseph Broz Tito. Okay, how Tito became involuntary rebel, revolting against Stalin because of circumstances, and how he eventually split apart the world of communism, and how he created an alternative in addition to social democracy, which already existed in the West. Okay, so let's get going. We are not going to discuss the Second World War, because I assume that you either read about it or you took the courses, particular courses on modern Europe, and I assume you know the basics about the Second World War. Okay, you know that in this war, the major front, the major clash was on the Eastern Front, okay, in Eastern Europe, where Hitler and Stalin engaged each other since June 22nd, 1941. You also may know that Stalin ended up being an ally of the United States and Britain against National Socialist Germany, and eventually this brutal communist dictatorship headed by Stalin came out as one of the winners of the war, okay? And as you know, I told you many times, winners write history. Winners call the shots. And Stalin's Red Army, at the end of the war, quote unquote, liberated Eastern Europe, okay? Poland, Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, eastern part of Austria, eastern part of Germany, okay? All these areas were occupied by the Red Army and formally liberated, okay? And since US and UK depended on the manpower of the Soviet Union in this part of the world, okay? And since the Soviet Union depended on American hardware, we shouldn't forget about this, that Soviets most probably wouldn't won this war without unlimited American hardware that was literally provided for free to the Soviets as part of so-called land lease, okay? There was no way for National Socialist Germany, of course, to resist this unlimited manpower, the human resources of the Soviet Union, and unlimited American hardware, okay? So in the first place, this Hitler's reckless attack against the Soviet Union and declaring war on the United States, it was insane. insane step. All knowledgeable people knew as early as 1941 that it was only a matter of time when National Socialist Germany would be defeated. Okay, so don't buy these notions sometimes you can see in documentaries, history documentaries, where they show this tremendous power of the Nazi. It was nothing, you know. It's again compared to the military, human, and industrial potential of USSR and the United States, and National Socialist Germany, of course, was not a match. Okay. Anyway, since 1944, Soviet Union was invading Eastern Europe, quote unquote, liberating it, and planting here in this part of the world, Eastern Europe, planting here communist puppets. Not right away, but slowly, gradually. That's what Stalin was doing. There was a communist strategy, so-called fronts. First, they acted through front organizations. Okay, communists acted through so-called democratic organizations, which they used to as smoke screens, and gradually taking over power, this hegemony. That's an established tactics. You can see it in documents of Communist International Comintern. So we need to use at the first stage the front organizations, so-called third way democratic organizations, and then infiltrate them with communists, and eventually in the second stage to take over power and give it to communist parties. And that's exactly what happened in the Soviet Union, in Eastern Europe by 1948. Okay, and that's how the Cold War started, when Stalin literally occupied all these areas. Soviet troops were stationed in all these countries. All countries except Yugoslavia, we will mention. Something special was about Yugoslavia. It's very interesting. That's one of the reasons why Yugoslavian communism became nationalist. Okay, so all Eastern European countries were occupied by the Red Army, and here Stalin eventually planted his communist puppets, dictators. Okay, and the Western nations, US, France, and UK, did not immediately respond to this, because there was a naive expectation that there would be friendship with the Stalin's regime, there would be peace. As you probably know, in 1945, Winston Churchill in England lost elections to whom? To Democratic Socialists, Labour Rights, Labour Party in England, and Democratic Socialist government came to power in England. Okay, and they actually wanted to move toward democratic socialism. It was a short experiment that lasted until 1952, failed. We will mention it later, but still, I want to show you the context. At the same time, in the United States, there were a lot of naive New Dealers who still remained in power, who had these silly notions about the Soviet Union, that Stalin was bad guy, but he was our guy, he was our ally, and there would be cooperation, peace. The United Nations was created. Okay, but slowly there were a number of awakening moments. Okay, but like a cold shower showed to UK and US that they had to be alert about the Soviet intentions, and the Soviet Stalin had their own agenda, and they didn't mean peace, even though they talked about peace. Okay, Winston Churchill was the first to warn the United States. Again, when he was already retired, he lost, as I said, to the Labour Rights, Social Democrats, an equivalent of Social Democrats in UK. In 1946, he comes to the United States at the invitation of Harry Truman, who took over after FDR died. And he delivered a speech in 1946 at Fulton, Missouri. I think, yeah, Missouri, at local university. This speech became known as an Iron Curtain speech. In this speech, he essentially said that you are naive fools, you don't know the intentions of the Soviet Union, and these intentions are very aggressive. And right now, after Hitler was out, so we defeated Hitler, now Stalin became the major threat, okay? And it wasn't something that New Dealers who were still in power wanted to hear, okay? So that is why there was much talk about that he was a warmongering guy. But eventually, the Soviets themselves changed the minds of Americans and other people in Europe, okay, in UK. What were these steps? Stalin, first of all, violated promises given to US and UK at the end of the war that he would hold free elections in Eastern Europe. So instead, as I said, he planted by 1948, he planted everywhere his cronies, communist puppets, dictators, little Stalin-like puppets, okay, and unleashed the terror against political opponents, okay. Second, Stalin never believed that there would be peace between communism and capitalism, so he was preparing himself for a war. He never trusted UK and US, and throughout the war, he always tried to cheat, to deceive them, okay. Second, United States offered so-called Marshall Plan, its economic assistance to European countries which suffered from the war, okay? Basically, it was a bunch of direct grants to European governments to rebuild their own economy, plus tax credits were given to American companies to incentivize them to go to Europe to help to rebuild the European economy. The total amount of money that had been given to European countries, given as direct grants and invested into local economies, was $155 billion. So it was profitable both for Europeans and for American companies, okay. Soviet Union was also invited to participate in this Marshall Plan. Marshall, it's was named after George Marshall, U.S. Secretary of State, okay. United States invited the Soviet Union to participate, and Stalin refused, so he was afraid to open his country, okay, to the Americans. He was afraid of the American investments. Again, the fear was that the American companies would come and make Soviet economy dependent on the United States. So logically speaking, yes, he was correct, because if you really wanted to make your country independent, okay, I'm not talking about good or bad, so you have to avoid any context like current North Korea, right? But on the other hand, you shoot yourself in the foot because you lose access to the most advanced technology, okay? You avoid cooperation, you avoid trade, and eventually you retard your own economy if you avoid trade relationships, okay? And Stalin was very, very suspicious of the West. Plus, after the Second World War, we are going to talk about it. The spirit of nationalism was on the rise in the Soviet Union, okay? And the suspicion of foreigners was high, okay? Stalin was afraid that his army that was exposed to the West, millions of Red Army soldiers and officers, found out that Germany they conquered, in fact, had higher living standards, okay? Germans had access to so many amenities which Soviets could not dream of, like radios, okay, like cars, individual cars, all right, like bikes. Even bikes were not accessible to the Soviets. So anyway, these small things which in the West were considered normal, even in National Socialist Germany, which was not exactly a friendly, user-friendly state, as we know, okay. But the Soviets were exposed to this, especially peasants were exposed to individual farming, individual farmers in the West and the Baltic countries, which Stalin occupied, and Austria and Germany, and they were literally shocked how well these individual farmers lived in the West, okay. And it was intimidating for the Stalin regime and for the Soviet nomenclature. Remember, nomenclature was the elite, so they didn't like the Soviets to be exposed to the West. They wanted to insulate the Soviet Union, Stalin and his cronies, okay. Exposure to the Western lifestyle was dangerous because it could undermine this communist ideology. So in this case, there was a rejection of Marshall Plan, and Stalin also ordered his puppets in Eastern Europe, dictators, a Polish dictator, like Bulgarian dictator, and so forth, not to participate in Marshall Plan, okay. So it created this wedge between the West and the Soviet Union, okay, and that's how the Cold War started, okay, Cold War. The United States asked George Kennan, who was a US ambassador to the Soviet Union, to make an assessment of the Soviet intentions and Soviet goals. So what did Stalin want? We expected there would be peace, cooperation, but we need to know exactly what Stalin wants. And George Kennan sent so-called the lawn telegram. It's a lawn cable. He sent to the United States, to the State Department, where he briefly described the Soviet intentions based on intelligence, US intelligence, and his observations of Soviet propaganda and Stalin's speeches. And his conclusion was that, unfortunately, instead of being open to the world after the Second World War, Soviet Union was becoming more xenophobic, more nationalistic. And Stalin wanted to intentionally insulate his country from the outside world, okay? He agreed essentially with the statement made by Winston Churchill. Remember, I just mentioned a few minutes ago that in his Iron Curtain speech, Winston Churchill said that Soviet Union was in fact turning into the major threat because it was becoming a xenophobic country that wanted to insulate herself from the outside world. And the country locked herself and Eastern Europe behind the so-called Iron Curtain. Remember this expression again. I want to remind you, that's what Churchill was talking about, the so-called Iron Curtain. Literally, Soviet troops were stationed here, okay. A barbed wire was installed along this border, and it became known as an Iron Curtain. So that's what Churchill said. A Soviet Union and her allies insulated themselves from the rest of the world by the Iron Curtain, okay. And that's what George Kennan agreed. He said yes. And Stalin, George Kennan added, was an aged and paranoid dictator who was afraid of assassinations, who was afraid of foreign influences or Western influences, and we cannot expect from him not only any concessions, but we cannot expect from him any cooperation, regular, normal trade relationships, because much in the Soviet Union depended on this personality. There was cult of personality. Remember, we mentioned the cult of personality. Stalin was the boss. Stalin called the shots. And this aged, paranoid dictator whose mind was infested with all kind of phobias, fears, projected them to the outside world. Okay. In the middle of this expanding Cold War, a competition between the Soviet Union and the United States, because after the Second World War, it was the United States who became the major opponent of the Soviet Union. Before it was England sort of, but now England was English economy was destroyed during the Second World War, and now the United States is the most advanced country in the West and in the world, actually, was asked by her allies to become the world policeman, for better or for worse. Okay, so Harry Truman declared this policy of involvement wherever and whenever the world of communism threatens to any country, so we would come and we would help. That was the message sent by President Harry Truman. Okay, and the Cold War was the competition primarily between the USSR, Soviet Union, and the United States. Okay, right amid this unfolding competition, Cold War, we have an interesting conflict, a side conflict emerging, a clash of the Soviet Union with Yugoslavia, which was a loyal communist ally of the Soviet Union. In fact, the first major communist country before China joined the Soviet Union in the communist camp, communist China was established in 1949. Okay, so before the communist China was established and became this first major ally of the Soviet Union, it was Yugoslavia. Okay, as I told you in the beginning of this lecture, that Yugoslavia was the only country of Eastern Europe which was not, quote unquote, liberated by the Red Army. Why? Because Yugoslavian Communist Party, communist movement was very powerful, and Yugoslavia guerrilla fighters headed by communists were able to kick out Nazi on their own at the end of the war. It was only in a few northern areas of Yugoslavia, Red Army troops entered, and together with Yugoslavian communist troops, they liberated the areas of this country. But primarily, almost overwhelmingly, the territory of Yugoslavia was liberated by Yugoslavians themselves, who were headed by the Communist Party of Yugoslavia. Again, Yugoslavia, it's like a mini Soviet Union. It was also a multi-ethnic country. Okay, right now it doesn't exist. If you know geography, there is no such country. This country disappeared in 1990, right? Like the Soviet Union, which disappeared a year late, 1991. So right now, instead of Yugoslavia, we have a bunch of these independent countries. Again, if you look at them, see, it's Croatia, Slovenia, Serbia, Macedonia, Montenegro, Bosnia, and Herzegovina. See, a bunch of independent countries. Different nationalities. Some of them are speaking similar languages, belong to similar religions, but not all of them. Like some of them Catholic, some of them Greek Orthodox, but all of them are Slavic people. So like belong to roughly to the same language family. Okay. So this country was a product of the First World War. When Austro-Hungarian Empire disappeared, this Yugoslavia was created in the wake of Austro-Hungarian Empire, and now this country was revived, but with communists in charge. In fact, the Communist Party was one of the biggest parties that belonged to Communist International, okay? And Yugoslavia communists were zealous Stalinists. They copied Stalinist methods. In fact, after communists liberated the country, they took over in 1945. They started to do collectivization at first, industrialization, cultural revolution. Remember these three things which Stalin had done in 1930, okay? And Yugoslavian Communist Party was headed by Joseph Broz Tito. It's a very charismatic guy who was a Comintern agent, again, agent of the Communist International. Joseph Broz Tito, actually, he spoke fluent Russian, and in fact, he in 1916, as early as 1916, as a soldier of Austro-Hungarian Empire, he was seized by the Russian imperial troops, and when Bolsheviks took over Russia, he joined the Bolsheviks because he hated the Austro-Hungarian Empire and he equally hated the Russian Empire, so he sided with Bolsheviks, became a communist, he married a Russian woman while in Russia, and eventually became a Comintern agent, okay, and Communist International Comintern put him in charge of one of the major people who were in charge of the Yugoslavian Communist Party, okay. So after the war, Stalin was sure that everything was fine and Yugoslavia was controlled by one of his puppets, okay. So he was considered one of the loyal Stalinists, and indeed he was a Stalinist. He was equally crude, rude, ruthless, okay. But what happened during the Second World War, by liberating country from the Nazi, Joseph Broz Tito became a charismatic person who acquired this spiritual aura that in the eyes of the people, not only Serbians and Croatians, by the way, he was half and half. He was Serbian Croatian, so his father was, as far as I remember, Serbian, mother was Croatian, or vice versa, okay. He was a product of two Slavic nationalities, Serbians and Croatians. Not only in the eyes of Serbians and Croatians, by the way, the fact that he was half and half also helped to entrench his power amid these two nationalities. But overall, in the eyes of other Slavic people, he became this charismatic leader, okay, who kicked out aliens, Germans, from the country, okay, and who wanted to rebuild Yugoslavia. Yes, he was a communist, but at the same time, in the eyes of Yugoslavian people, overall, he was a good guy who liberated the country from Germans, and he wanted to do, kind of establish a good life for Slavic people, okay. He had a big prestige in the country. Another important thing during the Second World War, fighting against Nazis, he created, throughout this resistance movement, he cultivated a group of loyal comrades who were personally loyal to him, okay. Soon in 1947, 1948, Stalin started to express his suspicion of this guy. Stalin was always jealous of any independent communist who could challenge his authority, because he wanted to be the Red Pope. Again, I'm using this expression, the Red Pope, as a metaphor, okay? So he wanted to be in charge of the communist world, and any potential competitor, of course, had to go. He could not tolerate anybody. But the clash between Tito and Stalin developed gradually, okay? At first, Tito wanted to help Greek communists, okay? Greece in 1946, 1947 was a battleground Between whom? Between communists, indigenous communists who wanted to take over Greece, and segments of Greek middle class that were supported by UK, who wanted to kick out communists. Okay, Stalin made an agreement with Churchill that Greece would be the British sphere of influence. I'm not going to into Greece, okay? But in this case, don't touch me in Eastern Europe, okay? That, by the way, was one of the excuses which Stalin used. You know, we divided the spheres of influence, so I'm doing my things in Eastern Europe, I'm planting my puppets, okay? Even though I promised to hold free elections in Eastern Europe, yeah, so what? I'm not doing it, but it's my zone of influence, you know. I gave you Greece, Turkey, it's your field of influence, UK, okay? And don't go beyond this, okay? So Greece was reserved in geopolitically for UK, but Tito, independently of Stalin, provided guns and ammunition to Greek communists, okay? And Britain complained to Stalin about, so you broke this gentleman's agreement. And Stalin was mad at Joseph Broz Tito that Tito did not consult with him, okay? So independent action, that's what disturbed Stalin. On top of this, Tito, being an influential, charismatic person, he started to provide help to Bulgaria, sending his agents, and especially to Albania. Albania, it's a small country on the border with Yugoslavia. Again, look at this map, okay? See, Albania is here, right here. So Tito started to provide help, military help to Albania, although Albania was controlled by communists already, okay? It was also a Stalinist country, and there was a guy, a dictator, I'm not going to mention his name, we have enough names, a pro-Stalin dictator who controlled this country, but Tito wanted basically to become a regional boss, a regional dictator. So he nourished this hope that by providing help, advisors to Bulgaria, which was also a communist country, controlled from Soviet Union, and then by sending his agents to Albania, he would be able to bring these countries, to drag these countries into Yugoslavia. And eventually, his long-time project of Tito was to create this Balkan Communist Federation, okay? Balkan Communist Federation. And of course, unavoidably, it planted the fear in the mind of Stalin, because how could I tolerate this regional boss who tried to build his muscles? So, even so what? He was a communist, but it's a challenge to my authority. That's what how Stalin viewed his independent activities, okay? So he invited Tito a few times. Tito said, yes, we're going to talk with you, we're going to consult you, but still continued his policies, okay? He could not resist. He didn't want to undermine his charisma. And indeed, inside Yugoslavia, Tito had a very powerful influence, okay? So he didn't want to diss his own charisma. Why should he do it? Okay. At some point, Stalin confronted Tito. Are you listening to me, or you are doing on your own and you are going against me? Okay. Basically, Stalin ordered Tito to not to make any steps on the international arena without consulting him, Stalin. Okay. And of course, Tito, after talking with his own comrades, said, no, we cannot do it because we liberated our country on our own. We love you, Soviet Union, because you are the kind of cradle of communism, but we cannot do it. And here I would like to quote you an important quote that shows that how gradually Yugoslavian communism started to acquire this nationalistic features, okay? So how Yugoslavia eventually, willy-nilly, because of these circumstances, this dispute between a big dictator, Stalin, a small dictator, Tito, So Yugoslavia communism started to find its own way of building communism. Okay, what is this quote? Quote is very important. Look what Tito responded to Stalin when Stalin confronted him, and he said, listen to me and don't make any independent steps. So you have to be my servant, essentially. And in response, Tito and his comrades answered, no matter how much each of us loves the land of socialism, USSR, he can in no case love his country less. It's a very important. It shows that how nationalism was more powerful than this class loyalty, the loyalty to this cosmopolitan doctrine of socialism. Plus, again, remember Stalin actually positioned this, he kind of killed two birds with one stone. On the one hand, Stalin successfully in 1930s, 1940s, promoted this idea of himself as the shield of socialism, that socialism was a cosmopolitan international doctrine. On the other hand, he said you have to defend national interest of the Soviet Union because Soviet Union was the land of socialism. See, he tried to use the Western public opinion and communists in other countries to defend the national interest of the Soviet Union in the guise of this internationalist doctrine of socialism. A very smart geopolitical step. So in this case, Tito challenged Stalin by saying that no, we cannot listen to you all the time, so we're comrades, but you offended us, essentially. And that's how Stalin in response called him a fascist. Of course, remember I told the fascist and Nazi were becoming smear words. So Tito in Soviet newspapers was immediately labeled a fascist, and Trotsky, because it's another smear label. There were also a few attempts on Tito's life. Stalin ordered his execution because Tito dared to challenge him. Okay. In fact, if you're interested, I wrote an article about one of these guys, Joseph Grigulevich, a Soviet spy who operated in the West, who was ordered to assassinate Joseph Broz Tito. I happen to know this guy by chance. On the late, I found out that he was involved into this plot. So it's an interesting biography. This guy named Joseph Grigulevich, who was a Soviet secret agent in the West, was ordered to kill Joseph Broz Tito in 1953, but fortunately Stalin died and he wasn't able to finish his act. Anyway, it's a different topic. Sorry for sidetracking. What is more important here is denouncement on the part of Stalin or Tito contributed to a patriotic surge in Yugoslavia. So people, not only communists, but generally all Slavic people who were part of this Yugoslavian state, they became united around Joseph Broz Tito, around the Communist Party. So there was no way to kick them out. Okay. And plus, the United States stepped in. Of course, it was really good for the United States because in this case, US and the West in general received this chance to take advantage of this fight within the communist world. And quickly in 1950, US Congress adopted Yugoslavia Emergency Relief Act to provide credits, monetary help to Yugoslavia because Soviet Union immediately removed all advisors, immediately refused to provide any help to Yugoslavia, trying to suffocate Yugoslavia into submission. And that's when the United States stepped in, helping Yugoslavia. So it was a very tricky situation. On the one hand, we have essentially Stalinist dictator who was in charge of Yugoslavia, who was denounced by his father, so to speak, okay, ideological father. And United States, capitalist United States, coming to help Joseph Broz Tito, okay. So what happened ideologically? In order to solidify his influence, Tito and his comrades needed to come up with some kind of alternative project to Stalin's socialism, to offer some kind of alternative. They couldn't keep doing what they were doing. Okay, how could you define or protect your identity? How you identify yourself? How did you cast yourself against Stalinist socialism? You had to come up with something. They didn't want to, they were loyal communists. They didn't want to move away from the communist doctrine because they were true believers, okay? That's when Yugoslav communists turned to so-called sacred books of Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin, trying to find their some kind of ideological blueprints, okay, what they might do to offer alternative, some kind of alternative to Stalin socialism, okay. So some friends, Joseph Broz Tito himself, he was not a theoretician. So even, Stalin was to some kind of theoretician. He liked to read, as I told you before. Stalin was not a regular thug. Yeah, he was a thug in his youth, you know, he was a street fighter, but at the same time he was an intellectual thug. So he had education, self-educate. He read the books. He tried to write theoretical works. You know, he liked to think about himself, Stalin, as a Marxist theoretician. But Joseph Broz Tito was not. Compared to Stalin, he was not a well-read person, okay? Stalin was more educated than Joseph Broz Tito, but Joseph Broz Tito simply knew that he had come up with some kind of alternative. So that is why those friends around Joseph Broz Tito, intellectual friends, I can mention the names. It's a guy named Kardelli and another important guy, Milovan Djilas. Milovan Djilas, it's the guy who wrote this book, The New Class. Remember, in one of my previous lectures, I mentioned a name of Yugoslavian dissident who originally was friends with comrades with Joseph Broz Tito. Only later he broke away from Yugoslavian communists, okay, and became a dissident. Milovan Djilas and others came up with this concept of so-called socialism of self-government. They read the books, articles by Karl Marx, where Karl Marx had some vague ideas about how future communist society should be organized. Remember, I mentioned that Stalin didn't write, Marx did not write too much about how the future communist society would be organized. He only planted in his manuscripts and his published works like a few sentences, a bit here, a bit there. There was a work named German Ideology, I quoted once, German Ideology, where he said that a future communism should be represented by a bunch of free associations of free producers. Okay, free associations of free producers. And then we have Lenin and EP, we have NEP policy, remember, new economic policy, where commanding heights were controlled by Communist Party, but were down below in agriculture and to some extent in industry, like private enterprise, was tolerated, okay? Remember, Lenin designed this system of NEP, new economic policy, as a compromise, right? Which eventually should be dissed when the Communist Party would be more powerful, okay? But Tito, Joseph Broz Tito, picked it up and said, hey, that's the socialism, that's real socialism, we're going to do it. Half and half, yeah, commanding heights belong to the Communist Party, and down below we're going to allow some limited freedoms to people. Associations of free producers, okay? like Karl Marx said. See, they tried to justify reforms. They started reforms when they broke away from Stalin. Yugoslavia communist Joseph Broz Tito started to experiment with something new. They wanted to reform Yugoslavia socialism. Okay, an interesting thing. Yugoslavian Communist Party renamed itself. Look, I purposely draw your attention to this. They renamed themselves, the Communist Party of Yugoslavia, into League of Communists of Yugoslavia. Does it remind you something? The League of Communists of Yugoslavia. I'm sure it does remind you something. Remember Marx and Engels? The Communist League. Remember, Marx and Engels had put themselves in charge of a small group of German emigres in France and Belgium who were called the League of Just, and renamed this league in the Communist League, wrote the Communist Manifesto, and that's how the communist movement started. So the reason I am drawing your attention to this is to show how desperately Joseph Broz Tito and Milovan Djilas, his comrade, the theoretician, wanted to show that they were loyal to the roots of the creed. You know, they were loyal to this quote unquote sacred books of Marx. Okay, so they even this name change. You know, wanted by change the name of the Communist Party. They wanted to emphasize we are the true believers. So Stalin was not authentic communist. We are authentic communists. See, and that's how they clashed with Stalin. They blamed him in what? In extreme nationalization. They said the Soviet socialism was a very, very harmful socialism. It's a statist socialism. So we're not going to have it. We are going to have self-government, self-management socialism, or self-government socialism. Different names. I don't know exactly how to translate it from Serbian Croatian. Sometimes it's translated as self-management socialism, or socialism of self-government. Okay, and I'm going to explain to you so how Tito and his comrades understood this Yugoslavian model, so how they wanted to challenge Stalin, what they actually were doing. Okay, Tito and his comrades, they did liberalize the economy. But at the same time, they maintained, like Soviets on the NEP in the 1920s, he maintained all commanding heights. And one-party dictatorship was maintained. So political power was not up for grabs. Yeah? There were no elections in Yugoslavia. It was one-party dictatorship. And the secret police was there. But down below in economic life, and I will show you charts that would explain to you. In economic life, especially in agriculture, he did allow people some elements of freedom. Okay, definitely it was a more open country than the Soviet Union. So Yugoslavia became a more open country. So in contrast to the Soviet Union, Tito's regime became more liberal. And one of the major aspects of this regime was decentralization. So decision-making to some extent in economic field, I repeat, not in political. Politics was in the hands of Tito and the League of Communists. But in economic life, decisions were decentralized. So local factories, local farmers, they could make decisions, okay, on their own. In the factories, Tito established so-called self-management. Let me explain to you how it worked. You know, on the one hand, Tito could not, of course, go against the creed. Okay, he could not. He never wanted to privatize factories. Like there were no big private companies that owned factories. There was no stock market. Okay, in Yugoslavia. There were no shares, stock shares. Okay, a person couldn't come and buy like a factory. There was no way for this, okay? The factories still belong to the state. That's an interesting thing. All major factories belong to the state. But the collectors, workers, and management who worked for these factories, they had the right to hire and fire people. They had the right to increase salaries. They had the right to elect their own management. Elect. Okay? So state factories were self-governing collectives. Okay? So they were not directly subjected to the state control like in the Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union, so-called Gosplan, Central Planning Bureau, issued quotas, ordered factories how much they had to produce, appointed managers, okay? And there was no way in the Soviet Union to fire somebody, okay? Everybody had to be employed, okay? A minuscule salary, of course, it's a welfare subsistence level, but the Soviet constitution specified that no worker was to be fired. In fact, no person in the Soviet Union was to stay idle. If people didn't want to work in the Soviet Union, they had to go to prison. So everybody had to work for the state, okay, in the Soviet Union. And all factories, all farms in Soviet economy belonged to the state. But in Yugoslavia, it was different. See, the state-owned factories now were controlled by collectives. There was no private property, but at the same time, there was no direct state control. So, in this case, Yugoslavian socialism is kind of middle of the road. Instead of the state, like in the Soviet Union, the state was the major power. Everything was controlled by the state. In Yugoslavia, at least in economy, not in politics, in economy it was a collective, a working collective. So it was a bunch of working collectives, thousands of working collectives who were independent, and the state factories could compete with each other. That's an interesting thing. Okay. Plus, in 1950s, Joseph Broz Tito stopped collectivization, and collectivization was eliminated. In agriculture, no collectivization. In fact, he even made a step further. He said farmers could own the land privately, which is unusual. Although they couldn't sell it. See, it's another interesting thing. So it was limited. When I said private, of course, we should put it in quotation marks. Yes. Okay, because when you cannot sell your land plot, you cannot say it was private. Okay. I would say semi-private. And of course, farmers, Yugoslavian farmers, could not create a big commercial farms. Okay, creating big agricultural farms. It would be capitalism. So like under Lenin's NEP, New Economic Policy, there were caps. Like if it was a farmer's family, yes, they could nominally own a big plot, which they inherited from pre-war conditions. And they could hold it, although they couldn't sell it. They could work it. It could be a big plot. It could be a smaller plot. They people could inherit this land plot, but they couldn't sell it. Okay. There were also limitations on the labor force they had to hire. Okay, like on the Soviet NEP. But still, it was like semi-private agriculture, which was very effective, very much effective, because farmers were incentivized. There was no collectivization. Okay. And plus, state enterprises competed with each other. And another important thing, people could travel abroad. So, unlike Soviet Union and other Eastern European countries that were literally shut down, so you couldn't cross the border. So nobody was allowed to travel. You couldn't go like from a Soviet Union as a tourist. When Stalin was alive, no Soviet person could travel abroad as a tourist. There was no way. Or just nobody could get a passport and travel. It was totally sealed, insulated country. only official delegates were allowed, you know, in a group. But Yugoslavia was an open country, so people could travel, and thousands of people did it and come back to country. Okay, so here I'm going to show you a few charts. So first, look at the Soviet model. Where communist party controlled commanding heights and total state control over industry, agriculture, land, wholesale and retail, service industry. We talked about it. And look down below, it's a small sliver here. It's a gray area. Black market, individual gardens. Some peasants had the right to have individual gardens. Remember, Stalin allowed them. And there were some cooperatives, some cottage cooperatives. So there were some within, around urban areas. People were allowed to have small plots of land they could use as their summer cottages. Okay, the land belonged to the government, but they were allowed to use this land. Okay, on a limited scale. So that is why people created the summer cottage cooperatives, and the black market existed, where people were able to illegally, essentially, to exchange things. So that is why it's a tiny sliver here. So because almost 90% of entire Soviet industry economy was controlled by the state. And now look at Yugoslavian model. That's what it was. Now, again, visually you can see the difference. At the top of the pyramid, again, a League of Communists of Yugoslavia. So all political life was controlled by communists. It was a communist dictatorship, but still economy was relatively free, regulated by the government. See, self-government in factories, private farmers, private in quotation marks, private service industry. So diners, restaurants, some repair shops, they could be owned privately by individuals. And co-ops, they were cooperatives, agricultural cooperatives. See, that is why we have this gray area, which in the Soviet Union hardly existed. Okay, see, in Yugoslavia was very much widespread. Okay, a few words about economic consequences of this model. Of course, definitely it was more productive, unlike Soviet Union, where the state controlled every part of life and where people were not incentivized to work hard. Okay, because Soviet Union, it was society of the total welfare. Imagine the whole country lived on welfare, where people were given these tiny salaries. Of course, I'm not talking about nomenclature. That's 400,000 people who were the new class. We're talking about the general population. It's a small salaries, subsistence level. Okay, you could not do any private enterprise. It was forbidden. Private property was forbidden in the Soviet Union. Okay, and that is why Soviet economy was a retarded economy. People were not incentivized, and eventually Soviet Union started to stagnate. We're going to talk about it. But in Yugoslavia, we have at least some economic incentives. Farmers, peasants were incentivized to work. They were not forced into collective farms. It's good. It was good. So that is why Yugoslavian agriculture was quite productive. Restaurant business, service industry was widespread, effective. Okay. To some extent, larger industry, industrial economy, factories. Let's say shoe factories. Yugoslavia has a highly developed shoe industry. There were quite a few shoe factories, or automobile factories. Some of you who are old, you may have heard about Yugos. Yugos even were sold in the United States. Okay, my actual friend, close friend, she 25 years ago, she drove Yugo. It was her first car, and she was happy about this car. And I'm not sure about the other people, but that's what she told me. But look how these collectives, factory collectives, work. On the one hand, they were able to produce as much as they wanted. They were able to compete. They were able to sell their products abroad, like in case of Uyghurs, even delivering cars to the United States, like charging for them less than American or Japanese manufacturers. That was one of the attractions, right? Or selling shoes to the West, again charging less for these items, and that was one of the reasons why they were competitive. But on the other hand, there was a big flaw in this system, okay, which essentially shows the flaw in this whole project of what market socialism. That's what it was. The Yugoslavian model can be called a market socialism, or in other words, it's an actual fulfillment of what Oscar Lange wanted. Remember, we mentioned this guy when we discussed a topic of socialist calculation debate. Remember? Friedrich Hayek, Ludwig von Mises, Oscar Lange. So if you forgot, just go to this lecture and you will see this guy, Oscar Lange, essentially in 1930s offered this type of system. He said commanding heights would be in the hands of the government, but in all other respects, we are going to have either private agriculture, okay, we would have unemployment to some extent, it would be allowed, unfortunately. At the same time, we are going to have state factories that would compete with each other, and a bunch of bureaucrats, government bureaucrats, they would set the major prices, especially for capital goods, okay. So it was like fulfillment of free market socialism model offered by Oscar Lange, okay. And what do we have under this system? Essentially, if you belong to a factory collective, so you want to increase your salary as much as possible, and you vote for increasing your salary because you are the person who controls the factory. You elect a manager or chief manager of factory who boosts your salary, and that's what happened. These factory collectives kept increasing their salaries, unfounded increases of salaries. At the same time, these working collectives, they were not interested in hiring new people. You had to be a relative of somebody who worked at this factory, or some very skillful, experienced, let's say, like specialist in something to be hired. You know, a regular person, for a regular person, it was hard to be hired into one of these working collectives because they were not interested in sharing their salary pool with somebody else. Okay, when I'm part of, let's say, 200 working collective, we are making shoes, and my salary is relatively high. If we hire, let's say, 25 new people, of course, my share goes down. So I'm not interested in this. That is why all these working collectives, they basically practiced what I call closed shop policy. Okay, it's like unions. Imagine we don't have too many unions in the United States, in Canada primarily, but just let's say automobile units. I'm trying to find some US example, analogy. Like, we still have some unions in automobile industry. So imagine members of union, they have a bunch of perks, this and that, high salaries, and they're interested in this. And of course, it's very hard to get into this automobile factory, US automobile factory that is heavily unionized. Okay, you have to be part of union. Okay, it's very hard to get in because people who are controlling this factory, okay, they are not ready to share these benefits with somebody else. It's not easy to be hired like a open shop place. Okay, I'm just trying to convey this message, how it worked. And of course, when you practice this closed shop policy, you have a huge unemployment. Yugoslavian unemployment was one of the highest in the world, 30%. 30%. This inflated salaries in country was going through a huge inflation. So the government had to print money. And unemployment was a horrible thing. So young people couldn't find work. But fortunately, Joseph Broz Tito allowed people, as I told you, people of Yugoslavia to travel abroad. That is why millions of people from Yugoslavia, they went where? To West Germany, to Austria, to Italy, to do some manual jobs, low paid jobs. Okay, that's how he tried to get rid of this huge unemployment. And last but not least, look at these PowerPoints. When, and that's a bad thing. On a regular basis, when a particular working collective was failing, government always bailed them out. So there was no payback for bad economic performance. So that's a bad thing. When you are not penalized by life for bad economic performance, how are you going to develop your economy? I'm sorry, there's no way. That is why, essentially, despite many incentives which Yugoslavian model did give to people, it was essentially a socialist economy, okay, where government always bailed out any failing collective. All right. So, but all in all, Tito, who tried to find his own socialist model, okay, he had to balance in international politics. Tito had to balance, to dance between the United States and the Soviet Union. As a communist, he didn't want to be with the United States, but at the same time, as a person who broke with Stalin, he didn't want to have anything to do with Stalin. So there was no military alliance, of course, between Yugoslavia and Soviet Union. And in fact, to the very end, as late as 1980s, Yugoslavia was never defined by the Soviet Union as a friendly country. Okay, see, that's how this legacy of Stalinism was powerful. Okay, and in fact, when after Stalin died and some Soviet individuals were allowed to travel abroad as tourists, as part of groups, Yugoslavia was never included in a group of socialist countries for the purposes of tourism. Why? Because it had open borders with the West. Okay, Soviets were afraid that some Soviet tourists who would come to Yugoslavia, they might escape to the West. Okay, socialist countries, true socialist countries, were only Eastern European countries which were allies of the Soviet Union, which didn't have open borders. Okay, so Yugoslavia was excluded. It was like a non-traditional socialist country. Okay, because Tito, I repeat, was dancing between the United States and the Soviet Union. And eventually, this middle ground position became reflected in international politics, where Joseph Broz Tito, along with a few other countries, I'm going to mention these countries, although you can see on this slide the name of the second country was India, which also tried to experiment with socialism, non-communist socialism. So India in 1960s, 1970s experimented with democratic socialism. Okay, don't forget about it. You might not know about this, but that was the fact. Indira Gandhi, you see her on this picture. Indira Gandhi, a long time, I wouldn't say dictator. She was elected, but again, it was a socialist country where in 1960s, 1970s, essentially a leading party called Indian National Congress, a nationalist party with a socialist orientation, imposed itself and controlled political and social and economic life in the country. And even though formally they had elections, see, quote unquote, the bad influence of the British system. Yeah, of course, I'm joking. So India could not go full ahead, like to become Yugoslavia, where still Nobody elected Tito. He was a dictator. In India, they did elect this woman for like many years, although she was an informal dictator. Okay, because Indian National Congress informally controlled the country, and they enforced through elections, through like managing elections, somehow guaranteed her leading role. Okay. Indira Gandhi and Joseph Broz Tito, the dictator of Yugoslavia, they became the founders of so-called non-alignment movement. It's like a group of third world countries that tried to dance between the US and United States, the US and the USSR. Okay, the countries that didn't want to support either country. Although many of these third world countries, they were socialist countries or countries with socialist orientation. Of course, Stalin was mad at what happened, very mad. Okay, in fact, he was so angry about this Tito's heresy that he tried to mobilize his allies, and again, he was happy that China joined the game, because 1949 China went communist, joined this club of communist countries, in addition to Soviet Union and Eastern European countries. And Stalin cracked down on those dissidents who might support Tito, so real and potential opposition. He purged some unreliable communists in Eastern Europe and planted so-called Muscovites, so direct agents of Moscow. And another interesting thing, he purged indigenous communists like in Poland, the indigenous Polish communists, in Czechoslovakia, indigenous Polish communists who were active during the Second World War inside these countries. And instead he sent direct agents of Moscow from the Soviet Union. Okay. Simultaneously, within the Soviet Union, we see the growth of xenophobia. It's a continuation of this national Bolshevik trend. Remember, we talked about it. So more and more catering to the Russian nationalism, but again, he still completely couldn't go full ahead in this direction. Although, I repeat, it was increasing cultivation of Soviet Russian nationalism. In fact, Stalin didn't talk about Russian nationalism. He talked about Soviet patriotism. So that's how it was called. And all other nationalities that lived in the Soviet Union, there were 15 major nationalities, as you know. They were encouraged to cultivate the Soviet patriotism. But the foundation of Soviet patriotism was Russian nationalism. There were certain national heroes of Russians who were advertised and who were held as icons, Soviet icons. Okay. Victory in World War II did boost the pride of the Russian people. Okay. I repeat, Russians were the majority in the Soviet Union. And in fact, at the very end of the war, when Stalin had a reception in Kremlin after the victory over Germany, it's May the 9th, 1945, Stalin, at the collective reception where hundreds of generals and Soviet bureaucrats came to participate, he raised a glass of wine and he said, "I'm drinking to the health of the Russian people." See, for the first time he said it. He never said it before. Okay. So we do see here this desire to cater to the ethnic sentiments of Russians. Simultaneously, Stalin becomes more and more conservative, suspicious of the West. Okay. And we see propaganda posters being published in the Soviet Union after 1945 that gradually, slowly, again, issuing praises to the Russian people. First, we have posters praising the Soviet motherland, like a first poster you can see here. "May our motherland flourish." Okay, but at the same time, the second poster appears a medieval Russian hero, unidentified, warrior, medieval Russian warrior with this Stalinist warrior, like an engineer, paired and with this inscription, "Glory to the Russian people, a mighty creator. Glory to the Russian people, the mighty creator." Interesting. In the third poster, you see a bunch of these Soviet pioneers. It's a Soviet analogy of Boy Scouts. They were wearing red kerchiefs with a teacher, okay, in a classroom, and the inscription, "Love your motherland." See, so it's Soviet/Russian patriotism. It's not complete Russian nationalism, okay. Still, there were some elements of internationalism, but heavily based on Russian icons. So, again, Stalin had to involve some Russian icons, but at the same time, he had to talk about Soviet patriotism. He had to acknowledge other nationalities. Okay, other nationalities were encouraged to build up their indigenous folklore by looking into the indigenous people's heroes. Okay, so basically, the message was simple: do not celebrate your old-time kings, lords, but find in your indigenous history some grassroots heroes, leaders of national liberation movements, okay? And in this case, you, like Ukrainians or Kazakh people, so you find the local people's heroes and you have to praise them, but be careful praising them. You have to praise only primarily those who were calling to establish friendship with Russian people. So these were the indigenous heroes, which in local areas were singled out to be praised. See, it was a very sophisticated system. I repeat, the Soviet Union was a multinational country, and even though Stalin promoted to some extent Russian nationalism, he could not completely diss the other nationalities. Okay, one of the major political campaigns of this time, late Stalinism. Okay, and again, Tito's heresy contributed to this, and xenophobia, this paranoid desire of the aged dictator to insulate Russia, did contribute to this campaign. It was a crusade against so-called ruthless cosmopolitans. Okay. It was not directly against a particular nation. That's what's important to keep in mind. The campaign against ruthless cosmopolitans was built on this suspicion of diaspora nationalities. Remember, Greeks, Poles, Germans, Koreans, Finns, Finnish people. So these nationalities within the Soviet Union who had a bunch of relatives abroad. Okay, so these people were to be purged, suppressed, locked down in concentration camps. But now, in the wake of 1945, it was a general suspicion of the Western culture. Okay, Stalin came to conclusion, and he was right in this respect. Remember, I told you that during the Second World War, millions of regular Soviet soldiers became, by the sheer fact of moving to the West, exposed to the Western ideas, exposed to Western daily life. They had the chance to talk with Western people, okay, interact with them. And they discovered for themselves that the life could be different. So now Stalin and his cronies come to conclusion that Soviet people became contaminated with Western ideas. So essentially, the campaign against ruthless cosmopolitans was campaigned against Western influence, Western culture. For example, such symbols of Western culture, like the jazz music, okay, like Soviet intellectuals holding Western science in the high esteem. It was suspicious. So Soviet engineers, scientists were encouraged to praise the Russian science. Okay, at this time, after the Second World War, the bizarre notions spread around in Russia. So in Russian propaganda and daily newspapers and books, they started to promote these ideas that Russians were the first to invent electricity, steam engines, electric bulb, which again, you may laugh at this, but again, you can see these type of ideas among insecure nations or insecure ethnic groups, that they try to say, we were the first to invent this, we were the first to invent that. You know, it shows this deep insecurity of these people when they try to jump and argue. So we were the first to do this, we were the first to do that. It's a funny, but at the same time, it's a very good litmus test to test how secure or insecure particular nationalities or groups about their own identity. So in this case, it was clear that Stalin and his nomenclature, they were very much insecure about themselves. They were afraid that this exposure to Western values could undermine this Soviet state socialism, okay, Stalinism. They didn't want it to be undermined. So Russian cultural heroes, again, Russian writers, Russian engineers, Russian scientists were to be praised, and those people who were praised in American science, like even talked about accomplishments of American scientists, English scientists, or like French scientists, they had to be smeared with dirt. Some of them lost their jobs. Okay, that was interesting message. Campaign against ruthless cosmopolitans. It was not a deadly campaign. It didn't lead to death sentences. There were some few death sentences, but on a larger scale, it didn't lead to death sentences like in 1930s when like hundreds of thousands of people were killed. But some people ended up being in prison, and a lot of people were kicked out from jobs for praising Western science or sharing some kind of story about accomplishments of American economy, or on many occasions just a lot of people were kicked out from their jobs because they were smeared by their colleagues who wanted to settle scores with them. Okay, jazz music was completely eradicated at this point. Okay, which in fact even during the Great Terror it was still popular, jazz music, 1930s. But now it was declared by the Stalinist regime a degenerate music. Okay, because it's a Western music. The ugliest aspect of this anti-cosmopolitan campaign against ruthless cosmopolitans was anti-Semitism. Okay, since Jews remained the last group that maintained a lot of diaspora links, a lot of Jews had their relatives in other countries. So that is why Jews now became the major target during this campaign. So a lot of Jews lost their jobs, and in fact the Jewish name at the end of 1940s, early 1950s was like a black mark. Okay, a lot of Jews were either kicked out from their jobs, Jewish professionals, or ostracized. Okay, the most horrendous example of this growing anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union was so-called doctor's plot. I will mention it, I will describe it in a few moments. But before I do it, I want to outline briefly what particularly horrified Stalin. In 1945, a debate started within the United Nations, the newly created international organization, the UN. Within UN, a debate started to create state of Israel or not. Okay. Originally, ironically, the United States was against this idea, but Stalin wanted this state to be created. Why? Because he thought that since in Jewish communities socialist ideas were very much popular, his hope was that he would plan the new state of Israel with a bunch of socialists who, not directly communists, although they were many communists who went to live in Israel, who migrated to Israel. There was a huge migration at that time from Eastern Europe. So his hope was that just to send their bunch of tide or wave of these communists or sympathizers, and they would be his puppet state. So that Israel would be his puppet state. That was his hope against England. So he wanted Israel to be like his front country fighting against England, because England was trying to dominate the Middle East. So Stalin even supported Israeli paramilitary units with his weapons, if you don't know. So the thousands of guns, ammunition were sent from Czechoslovakia on the orders of Stalin to Israelis, to help them to fight against Arabs during this first war, Arab-Israeli war. When did it happen? 1947, 1948. Okay, so Israeli paramilitary units were armed with Stalin's weapons. But as you know, unfortunately for Stalin, it didn't happen. So those people who came to live in Israel, although there were many communists among them, they did eventually sign with the West. Okay, so they didn't fulfill the hopes of Comrade Stalin. And on one occasion, a new ambassador of Israel, this newly created state of Israel, appointed her ambassador to go to Moscow. And this woman ambassador named Golda Meirson, later she became one of the prime ministers of the state of Israel. So this woman, who was appointed by this new state of Israel in 1948, she goes to Moscow. Okay, the Israeli embassy was built in Moscow. She comes to Moscow, and she was welcomed spontaneously by thousands of Moscow Jews who come to welcome her. It was a huge gathering. The first gathering in the Soviet Union that was not approved by the government since, 1923. A spontaneous sympathies of Soviet Jews who came to welcome this newly appointed Israeli ambassador. And some of them tried to talk with her in Yiddish language. Yiddish, it's a folk language of Jews in Eastern Europe. This horrified the Soviet secret police. This horrified Stalin because he could not control the situation. And that's when he started to question the loyalty of the Soviet Jews. So he literally was petrified. So his fear was that the national ethnic sentiments of Jews would be more powerful than their loyalty to the Soviet state. That I'm telling you right now in such detail to emphasize what prompted him to unleash this anti-Semitic campaign against Soviet Jews. Anyway, in the wake of this visit, in the wake of this campaign against ruthless cosmopolitans, Jews became the target. Thousands of them were kicked out from their jobs, and the pinnacle of this campaign was so-called doctor's plot. Stalin ordered his secret police to manufacture as a legal case against the Jews, and the secret police had to abide. In 1949, one of the Politburo members, remember Politburo, it was a small group of 9 people who controlled the Soviet Union. Okay, Stalin and his friends. One of these people died from natural causes. But before he was undergoing a treatment in a governmental hospital, and one of the nurses in the hospital who had a grudge against her colleagues, she wrote a letter to the secret police. She said, this particular guy, a member of Politburo, he was poisoned by the enemies of the people. And of course, Stalin requested this letter to be used as an excuse to start this campaign against doctors evil doctors who tried to poison the Soviet leadership. So it's like medieval type campaign soon was unleashed against the Soviet Jews, and all Jewish doctors became like sitting ducks. It's amazing when you read the stories about that time, 1949 to 1953, like 4 years. If you were a Jewish doctor, it was really a little unsafe time for you to exist in the Stalinist Russia. Eventually, the Soviet police arrested more than 20 people who were accused in plot to poison the Soviet leaders. Okay. Fortunately, in February 1953, Stalin died. Okay, that was the end of this anti-Semitic campaign. Okay, historians argue that if Stalin lived 1-2 years more, like thousands of Jewish people would have been rounded up and exiled to the Siberia or Far East in some kind of remote area, but it didn't happen because Stalin died. Okay, that was of course treated as a huge tragedy because a large part of the Soviet populace, they developed this sympathy for the dictator. Again, you know that each people deserve the government they have. You know, some people were weeping when Stalin died. They thought they wouldn't be able to survive without this great father who was taking care of them. But immediately the campaign against ruthless cosmopolitans, quote unquote, ended. Okay, immediately when Stalin died. So which was, even his cronies understood that it was a fake company, that was like a horrendous, I repeat, medieval type case. In fact, that horrified the whole world. One of the reasons why Soviet Union started to gradually lose its respect in the eyes of the people, it was this anti-Semitic campaign. Okay, what is amazing that a lot of people, despite these facts, they still maintained until at least 1956. They still maintain some faith in the Soviet Union. Okay, which shows that how the people who want to believe, they believe despite all kinds of facts. Okay, still there were millions of people all over the world. They believed Soviet Union was the cradle of true socialism, and despite this anti-Semitic attack, brutal medieval type attack on Jews, they continued to believe. Millions of communists in France, UK, Italy, US, they still held the Soviet Union in a high esteem, which again proves that communism and socialism contain again a powerful spiritual element of faith. When people are ready to neglect any kind of facts that go against their faith. Okay, when after Stalin died, immediately a struggle for power started between a chief of secret police, Lavrentiy Beria, you can see his picture here, and a chief of Moscow city branch of Communist Party named Nikita Khrushchev. Okay, this guy, by the way, was the only member of Politburo who had a college education, a highly educated man, Lavrentiy Beria, chief of secret police. All others, including Stalin, although Stalin was a well-read person, they didn't have college education. And this guy, Nikita Khrushchev, only had 7 classes of secondary school. That was his education. A working class man who was promoted by Stalin during Great Terror. Okay, and this guy was also promoted by Stalin to replace, during the Great Terror, the chief of secret police, who was blamed for Great Terror. That's the irony of the situation. So these guys were competing, and since the majority of the Soviet nomenclature, ruling elite, were afraid of the chief of secret police because he had compromising materials, files on all other communist bosses, communist bosses united against this guy. And they believed that this village fool, this guy with 7 classes of secondary education, he would be a safe choice. He wouldn't be a threat. Okay, so eventually Khrushchev led a plot against the chief of secret police. The guy was arrested and executed, and Khrushchev became the leader. Khrushchev became the new leader. Unlike Stalin, he was more outgoing, smiling, liked to shake hands, totally different. Stalin was cold, inaccessible, like this sphinx, this locking himself in this Byzantine Kremlin area, inaccessible to regular people. Hardly showed up in front of the other people, Stalin. But this guy, just the opposite. And in fact, Khrushchev was playing the role of a holy fool, so to speak, in Stalin's circle. Stalin usually used him in his evening, invited him in the evening when he needed to be entertained, because Khrushchev knew a lot of anecdotes, stories. Occasionally he was even performing like a small dance in front of Stalin. So he behaved in this, like, each company, has some kind of fools who kind of crack jokes, who acted street smart, full of jokes, who could sing, who could dance. So that the guy, and all other communist bosses thought he was just a person with a limited education, crude, so he wouldn't be a threat to their leadership. And of course, as always happens, it wasn't the case. Essentially, this so-called unpolished person with little education, as it frequently happens, became the leader, okay, who was able to become the number one. Essentially, Khrushchev guaranteed that the power now would be reserved for so-called nomenclature. Again, remember, nomenclature. I keep repeating this word. Nomenclature, this group, this new class of Soviet leaders, 400,000 people, who were not to be tried in regular courts, who had their own life, whose families had special stores. Okay, it's like communist bureaucracy that controlled the life in the country. Okay, Stalinist elite, high party officials, secret police, chief bosses, army bosses, couldn't be tried in regular courts, had special privileges. If you know more about the life of this class, there are books published. Milovan Djilas, by the way, one of the comrades of Joseph Broz Tito, wrote this book called The New Class, 1959. Milovan Djilas eventually became disillusioned with communism and socialism in general. So at first he was a comrade of Joseph Broz Tito, but then parted ways with Tito, started to criticize him, and Tito actually locked Milovan Djilas in prison because Djilas attacked the idea of socialism in general. Okay, and he released this book called New Class. He was the first to describe nomenclature as the new class of people who control the regular people. Okay, there's a special book about nomenclature which expands this idea of Milovan Djilas, written by a Soviet historian who defected to the West, Mikhail Vaslensky, and the title of the book Nomenclature. So you can read this book if you have free time. Okay. Khrushchev guaranteed, he said, we should exercise power collectively, and he criticized Stalin. Khrushchev started to criticize Stalin. Particularly, he focused on so-called cult of personality. He said, we had this cult of personality and it did great damage to the cause of communism. Okay. Khrushchev said, we need to clean the image of communism. Stalin was a bad guy. He spoiled the image of communism. See, Khrushchev did not criticize communism itself. He was die-hard communist himself. But he started de-Stalinization. He liberated political prisoners from Gulag at a network of concentration camps. He reduced the power of the secret police. Good thing, right? But at the same time, he always emphasized that communism was very good, and the whole idea of socialism in general was a good idea. But the Stalin was this bad apple. A bad apple. He damaged the image of communism and socialism in general. Okay, so we need to clean the image of the left, and everything would be fine. In his secret speech, called Secret Speech, why? Because in 1956, during a Congress of the Soviet Communist Party, Khrushchev delivered the speech to the communist bosses, to this nomenclature, to the members of the nomenclature, plus foreign communists, selected few who were allowed to listen to the speech, but not for regular people. That is why it became a secret speech, but I put it in quotation marks. I will tell you why. 1956, Khrushchev denounced during this Congress Stalin as a criminal. He said that he was a criminal. He destroyed a lot of good communists. So we need, as I mentioned right now, to clean the image of communism. But the next day, this secret speech was published in New York Herald Tribune. So one of the foreign communists, specifically, to be specific, an Israeli communist from Israeli Communist Party, who was present during this meeting, he shared this speech with his friend, who was a Polish communist, who was not at this meeting. And this Polish communist gave this text of the speech to an American reporter. Okay, and eventually this speech ended in the hands of New York Herald Tribune, so everybody knew about this speech. That is why we put it in quotation marks. What Khrushchev did, he first mended relationships with Yugoslavia, remember? Because Stalin was responsible. Khrushchev said, we don't need to fight with our brothers from Yugoslavia. And although there was no complete friendship with Yugoslavia because damage was done, still Joseph Broz Tito visited the Soviet Union. Khrushchev went to Yugoslavia. Trade relationships started between the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia. Okay, and Yugoslavia at least was recognized as a socialist country, not completely, I repeat. And by recognizing Yugoslavia, Khrushchev admitted there were different ways to socialism. So there were different models of socialism. And Joseph Broz Tito, in fact, said there are different models of socialism, which already showed that the world of communism gave a huge crack. So now we have two models, the Soviet model, centralized, heavily centralized socialism, and Yugoslavian model, market socialism. Most important, Khrushchev started so-called peaceful coexistence. He said, unlike Stalin, who argued there would be an imminent war between the world of capitalism and the world of communism, we do not believe in war. So there should be peace between the West and the East, and we should not emphasize this military confrontation. We should make peaceful agreements. And we are not going to peddle warfare rhetoric. We're going to compete with you, Western countries, peacefully, because Khrushchev argued, we believe that socialism is the best way, and economically, socialism would perform better than capitalism. So we don't need to fight with you militarily. We're going to beat you economically. That was his message, okay? At the same time, Khrushchev de-Stalinization had limits. I repeat, de-Stalinization was not directed against communism in particular and socialism in general. because Khrushchev was himself part of Stalinist system. Okay, he simply wanted to liberalize a little bit this system. Okay, in fact, his major goal was to create this secure life for the communist bureaucracy. And he did accomplish this, partially at least accomplish this goal. He wanted to improve the image of communism. And his major message, ideological, was let's diss the Stalin, we don't need his books, let's shred his writings. And that's what they did at that time. In Soviet libraries, Stalin's books were kicked out. It was amazing. Before, everybody worshipped Stalin, but by the end of 1950s, there were no Stalin's books in libraries. All of them were either thrown away or shredded. Newspapers with his portraits were eradicated. So Khrushchev tried to create the same memory hole, to ditch Stalinist heritage completely, to erase it. Okay. Instead, he said, we need to go back to the sacred books of Marx and Lenin, like Joseph Broz Tito, remember, before, did the same thing, trying to find, set up a new Yugoslavian model. So now Khrushchev was doing similar things, although, unlike Joseph Broz Tito, Khrushchev did not reform Soviet economy at all. So he did not disband collective farms. He did not eliminate centralized state control over Soviet factories. The only change he did, essentially, he eliminated Gulag. So he eliminated this great terror legacy. Okay, he released political prisoners, and he introduced some limited liberalization in literature, in arts, very limited. So hardly any changes. But his major slogan was that let's return to Lenin, let's return to Marx. Okay, let's read their books. So that's what was offered instead of Stalin's works. So basically, I'm going to use a religious language here. The message of Khrushchev was, let's get rid of this communist pope, Joseph Stalin, and let's go back to the sacred books, original sources, Marx and Lenin's works. And on this note, let me finish today's lecture. Thank you for your attention, and I will see you